Have you ever noticed that it is so much easier to judge others and so difficult when you have someone point out the flaws in your own life? You ever notice that to be true in life? The comedian George Carlin, whatever you might think of him aside, he once said something I think is funny. He said, "Why is it that everybody who's driving slower than you is an idiot, and everybody who's driving faster than you is a maniac?" And it's so true. It's so easy to be able to point out the flaws in other people, but it's so difficult to be able to face that in our own life and hear what might be critical and what someone might say about us. And the bottom line is, it's so tough because sometimes we can just see things wrong. We just totally have the wrong idea about people, and they can have the wrong idea about us. I read this story about this African man sitting down next to this English man at this conference dinner. And as they're at the table next to each other, not a word was spoken when finally the English man started thinking, well, this African probably doesn't know what's going on. This seems all new to him. And so whenever the food came and everything, he picked up his fork and he started eating, and he turned to the African man and he says, "Eat, yum, yum, yum. Good, eh?" And then he took his drink and he took a drink. He says, "Drink, slurp, slurp, slurp. Good, eh?" The African man didn't say anything, and in just a few minutes he got up and he walked to the stage, and he was introduced as the speaker for the night. He had served 3 years representing his country to the UN, and he had 2 PhDs, and he spoke impeccable Oxford English. African man gave his speech and went down and sat down back at the table where he had been previously, and he turned to the Englishman and he said, "Talk, blah, 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 blah." Good, eh? So many times we can just have the wrong perception, the wrong idea about people, and it's so difficult. It's not so bad when we can point out those in other people, but boy, if somebody gets the wrong idea of us, that just can really hurt. Here's the thing about judging. It's a mess. Because it's so tricky, it just makes it a complete mess. When someone judges me, I say, well, that's not fair. You don't really know me. You don't know who I am. You don't know what I've gone through. It just makes it messy as somebody tries to judge me. And if I judge other people, it can be messy too, because it's the same kind of thing. I don't really know them. I don't really know why they're doing what they're doing and why they're going through what they might be going through in their life. I can't always see the whole picture. And it becomes such a mess because I've done this. I've had the wrong first impression of people because I judged them poorly at the front. And later, I've turned out to become really, really great friends with these people. That's happened in my life before. I don't know if you've ever done that. But your first impressions and your judgments can be impaired. And maybe you write a person off and they turn out to be one of your best friends. Such a mess and so tricky in this game of trying to figure out who each other are and judging one another. And here's the thing, like in our world, here's what makes it just a complete mess. Think about our world now. You can't say anything at all without being considered judgmental, can you? I mean, start talking politics for 2 seconds. Oh, I can't believe you would believe that. I can't believe you would judge somebody else's opinion about that. Opinions, things that you think are true, someone else might have their own truth, and we live in this subjective age of subjective truth. What's true for you is true for you. What's true for me is true for me. And if you were to dare cross that line, you would hear this: "Oh, quit being so judgmental." And it makes it even more difficult and such a convoluted mess. And judgment is just a really tricky game. I think that's why Jesus confronts it. I think that's why Jesus hits it head on. He has something to say about judging. And you probably know the text we're going to. You probably know Matthew 7, verse 1, because a lot of people love to quote this verse. This might be your favorite verse, because you might have lived your life in such a way that you feel really judged, and you've gone through life having a lot of people judge you for maybe, I don't know, where you grew up, your family that you're from, something somebody else did that rubbed off on you as some sort of reputation, and you always had to try to overcome that. And so maybe people have seen things that have happened or know things that happen in you, and you love this verse. And maybe you're new to church. Maybe you haven't been around church. Maybe you don't like to go to church because church is just full of people who are judgy. And so this is the one verse you know because you like to give it to people who are judgy, and you like to share it. And Jesus uses this section, Matthew chapter 7, this section, what we call in the Sermon on the Mount, to confront head-on this whole mess, this whole tricky problem of judging. And he hits it head-on. And I have a hunch that when we're done, you're not going to like this. You're not going to like to hear it. You're probably, if chapter 7, verse 1 of Matthew is your favorite verse, it probably won't be when we're done today. I'm going to ruin it for you. I just want to let you know, a heads up, just straight from the get-go. You're probably not going to like what Jesus has to say here. And I'm talking because I know I don't like to hear what he has to say here. This isn't easy. See, we're going through the series that is called Questions Jesus Asked. And we're going to find a question in this text that's going to help us see this whole problem and this tricky nature of judgment and how we can really cut through the mess and why it is such a mess in the first place. Look at Matthew chapter 7, verse 1. Jesus says this, "Do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye?" There's the question. How can you say to your brother, "Let me take the speck out of your eye," when all the time there is a plank in your own eye? There's the question again. You hypocrite. There's that favorite word. First, take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. You probably have heard this before. You've probably thrown this verse around, or maybe had this verse thrown at you. Don't be so judgmental. Quit being such a hypocrite. Don't you know Jesus talks about this? So we need to start out by kind of clearing up the air a little bit. Let's talk about what this verse doesn't say. Can we talk about what it doesn't say? When you hear the word judge and read that there, it could mean several things in the original language. It can mean to analyze, to evaluate, or it could mean to condemn. It could entail those meanings. And so, what does Jesus mean when he uses this word judge? What's he really saying here? Is he saying don't analyze? Is he saying don't evaluate? Or is he saying don't condemn? What's he really saying? Well, to understand what Jesus is really saying here, I think it helps to go to a few other texts and kind of see some other things that kind of lay in the background of what's happening here. The first text I would like for you to turn to is 1 John chapter 4, verse 1. If you go to 1 John chapter 4, verse 1, you have the Apostle John giving us some helpful clues and to helping us understand. Because there's one thing that Jesus is not saying here. Jesus is not saying to you and me, you can check your brains at the door. That's not what he's saying when he says, don't judge. He's not saying just check your brains at the door. Don't think logically. Don't think through things. Don't analyze. Don't evaluate. He's not saying that. Here's a little insight to why and how I know he's not saying that. 1 John chapter 4, verse 1. Dear friends, John says, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits to see whether they are from God, because many false prophets have gone out into the world. That's a little clue, a little insight to know that as a person who is trying to follow Jesus, Jesus is not turning to you and saying, hey, check your brains at the door. Don't ever test anything, just always accept everything. It's totally fine. Don't even worry about trying to figure out what is true and not true. Don't worry. It's not saying that, because John is telling us there's going to be false. We talked about that last week. There is truth and there is false. And because there's going to be false, you have to be thinking. You have to be analyzing. You have to be evaluating. You want some more help to kind of help you get there? Go to 1 Corinthians. If you flip backwards in your Bible, and if you're not able to kind of keep up, maybe you've got your app, and that's nice. You can just kind of pull up 1 Corinthians. If not, these texts should be on the screen as we follow along here. 1 Corinthians chapter 5, if you look at verse 3. Another clue that I know that this is not what we might think this text is saying is 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 3, when Paul is writing a letter to the church in Corinth. Here's the problem. A man in that church is doing something really, really wrong. He's got sexual immorality in that he's sleeping with his own dad's wife. Not his mom, but his own dad's wife. That's the problem. That's why this book is written, if you want to know. Here's what Paul has to say about it. 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 3. For my part, even though I'm not physically present, I am with you in spirit. As one who is present with you in this way, I have already passed judgment in the name of our Lord Jesus on the one who's been doing this. That seems like Paul didn't pay attention to the Sermon on the Mount. He's passing judgment. Oh, why is Paul saying that? There's a man who's in his sin, completely unrepentant and not wanting to change his ways. And Paul goes on to say, kick him out of the church. So I know that Jesus is not saying in the Sermon on the Mount, don't judge in that kind of way. When you call a spade, when you analyze and when you evaluate and you see something that can be detrimental to a person's faith, Jesus is not saying, don't ever say anything. Don't ever think about things like that. He's not saying that. In other words, how in the world would Paul ever deal with that if he was trying to live in that kind of way? So let's make sure that chapter 7, verse 1 of Matthew, we don't make it say that. We can't ever talk about sin. We can't ever point that out, try to help somebody to help save their faith. Because that's not what Jesus is saying here. You want some more things to kind of help confuse you here? Let's go to Romans chapter 14. This hopefully won't confuse you, but this is why we sometimes wrestle so much with Matthew chapter 7. Is because of what things like Romans chapter 14 say. We can kind of take this attitude where sometimes we can get really, like I said, it's really, really tough when someone might come and say something to us that's judgmental. And that's why we like to throw Matthew 7:1 out there, because we like to say, don't judge me. Don't judge me. And Romans chapter 14, if you look at verse 4, here's what Paul says here. Who are you to judge someone else's servant? To their own master, servants stand and fall. And they will stand, for the Lord is able to make them stand. So Paul's saying, you've got a master and a servant. Let the master be in charge of calling what the servant is. And skip on down to verse 10 of that same chapter. You then, why do you judge your brother or sister? Why do you treat them with contempt? For we all stand before God's judgment seat. Okay, now which is it? Should I judge or shouldn't I judge? Paul is on one hand saying it's okay to pass judgment, and he's actually doing it. And on the other hand, he says, don't judge your brother and sister. So that's why if we start stacking all of this up, you start to see how this is pointing us, where this is giving us the direction to go. When Jesus is saying judge, you need one more verse, because this really, really helps. Galatians 6:1. Are your fingers bleeding yet? You got paper cuts? Okay, Galatians 6:1. This is a great text to remember. You've got to pile all these things together, because we kind of have to wade through this mess of what we make Matthew 7:1 mean when it probably doesn't mean. Galatians 6:1 says this, brothers and sisters, if someone is caught in a sin, you who live by the Spirit should restore the person gently, but watch yourselves, or you may also be tempted. Okay, so we can't judge our brothers and sisters. We can't treat them with contempt, but yet if we see them struggling with something, we need to go help them and restore them gently. We have this duty to analyze and to evaluate, and if we see something that might be damaging to someone, step in lovingly and restore them. But what is Jesus saying in Matthew 7:1? He's saying this: we should not be putting ourselves in God's judgment seat. We should not be putting ourselves in that seat, which means then I have the final power. I shouldn't convey to anyone that I call the shots on where their final standing is. In other words, we shouldn't be condemning of people. It is not our job to condemn the person. We should see sin and say, that's not healthy. That's not good. I need to help you because I love you and I want to help restore you. But we should not stand in a spot and say, you're done. You have no hope. You're a worthless, lousy sinner, and I don't ever want to talk to you again. There's no hope for you. That's not the position that we take. And so it's really important to start out by saying what 7:1 isn't saying. I hope you're getting that. I hope that if you've ever been offended by someone who would come and try to talk to you about your sin, even if they fail miserably at it, that hopefully if somebody's trying to really come and gently restore you, they're actually trying to do what the Bible says. If someone comes to you and says, you're a jerk, you're worthless, you're hopeless, you have no hope, I'm done with you, I never want to see your face again, then they've taken Matthew 7:1 wrong, and they've got it wrong. Sometimes the world looks at the church, and they see us trying to do the first thing, and it ends up looking like the second thing. And that's why so often we end up being called hypocrites so often as the church, because the world can't always see that our good intentions, hopefully, are not to pass a judgment on someone to say, you're out, but instead we're trying to say, I want to make sure you're in. And I want to be able to help heal you up from the hurt that you're in. So that's what Jesus isn't saying. What is he saying? He's saying, don't put yourself in that kind of seat. You can't have that kind of position. And you know why, because here's what happens. Sin turns you and me into self-righteous judges. That's what sin does. Our nature turns us into self-righteous judges. You ever notice that the things that most irritate you that other people do are the things that are your biggest flaws? You ever get irritated when somebody leaves a light on in a room and they leave a room? Oh yeah, bothers me. You know why? My dad used to holler at us all the time, turn the light off when you leave the room. All the time, and now it's ingrained in me. Turn the light off when you leave the room. And then you walk in and you're like, who left the light on in here? And then you're like, oh, that was me. I was just in here a little while ago. And that's what happens is our sin turns us into these self-righteous judges, thinking that we're so much better and we're so perfect and we've got it all together because I can just really do this and I never really mess up. And that's what happens, and that's what Jesus is really striking at here. That's why Jesus is confronting this when he says, don't judge or you too will be judged. You're going to be judged by your own words. You're going to be judged by your own actions when you put yourself, because of your fallen nature, when you put yourself in the seat of a self-righteous judge, you are missing it. Why do I do that? Why does my heart become this self-righteous heart? Why is this happening in my life? Well, I could say this. I could say, well, it's sin. But you know what? That's too easy. That lets me off the hook. So don't just say, oh, I'm so self-righteous because I'm broken and I'm fallen and I mess up and that's why I do that. Yeah, that's true. But would you just take a minute and look at your heart and try to figure out what's the motivation of your heart? What is behind this? What is this that's going on that turns me into this self-righteous judge? Do you know why I do it? Because it makes me feel better about myself. If I'm being brutally honest about my heart, the reason that I put myself into a seat of being a self-righteous judge makes me feel better about me. It's so much easier to look at other people's mistakes and flaws and wrongs, because then all of a sudden I start stacking all that up and like, God probably pretty proud of me. I got pretty good standing with God. And that's what happens in my heart. It's just so much easier, and it's such hard work to look at my heart and see the changes I need to make. And it's so much easier to be able to point out the changes other people might need to make. It's kind of lazy, isn't it? And that's what's going on behind the motivation of my heart. I don't know what your heart has going on behind it. I don't know the motivation. But here's what I know. I know if I live in that kind of way, it's a really hopeless way to live. It's a really helpless way to live. To be able to put yourself in that spot where you're a self-righteous judge, trying to convey to other people like you've got it all together, and they don't. And maybe you don't say that out loud, but you're thinking it. And the idea is that somehow we can present ourselves as acceptable to God, and it's so hopeless. Because when I start comparing myself to other people, here's what happens. When you compare yourself, and when I compare myself to other people, you're going to look around and you're going to find people who are worse than you, aren't you? It's pretty easy, in fact, to find those people. And you're going to start looking and you're going to say, well, at least I don't do that. And you're going to start seeing those people, and here's what's going to happen eventually. It's so hopeless because you know what it gives you? It gives you this false sense of security. Like, because I'm so much better, it's like J.D. Greer says, that someday when life is over, we all get to heaven and God grades us on a curve, because nobody's perfect. So he's going to grade on a curve, and so I'm going to try to get as high. Nobody's perfect, but I'm going to try to get as high up as I can. And just kind of get there to the curve, I'll make it in. And that's how we sometimes approach life, like, I'm better than that person, and that. look at what they did. And so he's trying to set ourselves up to have it's a real false sense of security. Let me ask you something. If you could think over your life and think about the 5 worst sins you've committed, the 5 worst ones. Think about the very worst thing. That comes to your mind really fast, doesn't it? And then take the other 4 with it, the top 5 of the worst things you've ever done in your sin life. And you could say, God could say to you, I'll take those away. How are you feeling about yourself? Feeling better, aren't you? Well, let's just up the number. Let's go to 50. You take the 50 worst moments of your life and just erase them. Tell you what, just go ahead and go up to 100. Feeling better, aren't you? Take away the 100 worst times and you're starting to think, I'm a pretty good person, actually. You know what? I am a good person. I'm a good little boy. And then you go up to 1,000. Let's just say you do 3 things wrong every day for a year-ish. Okay? Keep going. And as you keep going, you're going to start feeling better and better about your sin. But here's the thing. Until your sin is completely down to 0, you have no hope. Until all of your sins are completely taken away, there's no way that you can actually see yourself as having a right standing in front of God. I don't care how good you think you are by taking away all the bad moments. If there's still one sin left, you cannot stand before a holy God. And see, that's what happens when we compare as we judge. It gives ourselves this false sense of security to think, well, at least I'm not like them. Here's the flip side. Sometimes when we judge, we can put ourselves in a spot where we look at other people, and guess what you're also going to find? People that are better than you. You look around, right? You're like, oh, I wish I was like my Sunday school teacher. She's amazing. That woman was a saint. You know, and you start thinking about their life. You know, I know people from this church and the history of this church, and I think of them in that kind of way. You know, they were giants, spiritual giants. I've got Bible college professors and other preachers and other just faithful men and women in my life, and I think, oh, wow, they're so much better than I am. And you know what that does? It gives you a loss of assurance. You find yourself at a loss like, if I can't even be close to how good they are, what am I doing? I have no hope. And that's what happens when we play this judging game. I was with some friends this week, and we were eating some lunch, and then we were talking about Missouri S&T, one of the leading engineering schools in our country. And they said it's kind of funny because when a lot of students come to S&T, here's what happens. They show up, and everybody's a valedictorian or salutatorian. And that's never happened to them before. Because they come from their little town, from wherever they come from, or their big town, or their big or small school or whatever, and they're the valedictorian, and they walk on campus, they're like, oh, everybody's a valedictorian here. I'm not as smart as I thought I was. And we play that same game if we start judging spiritually. You'll find plenty of people who you think are so much better than you, and it leads you to a point of hopelessness because you have a loss of assurance. Like, can I actually be saved? Don't you see that getting caught up in this mess of judging is so tricky? Here's what Jesus has to say, and here's why he asks the question. Here's the question. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and you pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? Here's what Jesus is saying. You're blind to it. You can't see as you ought to see. And when Jesus asked this question, I really think when you start sinking your teeth into what it means to be judgmental, I think here's what starts to happen. As you start to understand your hopelessness, when Jesus asks the question, I think the light starts to come on a little bit. You're like, yeah, I'm so hopeless. I can't even see my own sin for what it really is. I can't even notice in the grand view of how holy God is what he actually thinks about my sin, no matter how small I might think of it. I still can't grasp how big of a deal this is because it's that plank shooting out of my eye and I can't see. The Bible has a great story about someone like this. You know him. His name was Jonah. You remember that story of Jonah? He runs when God says go to Nineveh. Do you know why he doesn't want to go to Nineveh? Oh, those scum of the earth people. There's no way I would ever want them to repent. Little judgmental Jonah gets on a boat and goes the other way. And then the storm comes up, and that arrogant man is on a boat with a bunch of pagan people crying out to these pagan gods, asking for the storms to subside, and he says, guys, it's me. My God's the best. Throw me in the ocean. He'll take care of me. He'll take care of everything. Let me show you. So judgmental, even in that moment. And they throw him in the ocean. He finally gets to go to Nineveh. And as he goes to Nineveh, you know what he does? He preaches, and then he goes out and he waits for the city to burn. Because he wants to sit in that seat of judgment. And of course, he gets so upset because he's so hot, and the shade comes over him, and then a worm eats that shade. And he's so mad because his shade is gone while he's waiting for God to burn up living souls. Because he'd rather sit in the seat of judgment. And he's so blind to it. He can't see his own sin. He can't see his own lostness. He can't see his own blessedness to be able to be called by God. There's nothing that Jonah did that made him deserving to have that call. It's that God called him. And see, that's what the point of this story and this question that Jesus asked does for us. It hopefully shows us that you can keep playing the judging game if you want, but you're soon going to learn that you're going to find yourself hopeless. You're going to find yourself helpless. And whenever you really start to think about this question, you're going to really start to see your blindness. How you're blind to how things really are. Because you can't see everything the way that God sees them, because you're not God. And everything that you see is a blur of what reality really is. Kind of a couple, they were moved into a new neighborhood, and they were sitting at breakfast one morning, and the wife looked out the window, and she saw the wash hanging on the line. And she said, boy, the wash on that line just sure does look dirty. Our neighbors don't know how to do laundry. This kind of went on morning after morning. They ate breakfast together, same thing, for about a month. And then finally, one morning, she sits down to eat breakfast, and she looks through the window, and she says, whoa, the laundry just looks amazing. Somebody must have taught them how to do the laundry. I wonder who it was. And the husband looked up from his breakfast and he said, this morning real early I woke up and I cleaned the windows. This is never about how to do laundry, was it? It was all about the perspective. And see, that's our blindness. We don't ever see with the right kind of perspective if we just sit in a seat of judgment. We either have a plank or we have a speck. And you know what the problem is? This is crying. This is yelling out to us, you are without hope because of the speck. And then Jesus says, I have no speck. I have no plank. I'm perfect. I am the one who actually can see everyone the way they need to be seen. I'm actually the one who can be judged. Do you know how you get to be judged? By becoming perfect. It's not like what we would think about a judge sitting on a bench in our courtrooms today. I'm talking about God as judge. I'm talking about someone who can see everything and judge perfectly. You know what it takes to get there? It's perfection. To be able to see everything completely, to see it all, every story of your life, everything that people are going through. If you knew everything that people were going through, and all of their backstory, and all of their environment, all their history, it would sure change how you think about them. And you know that's true because you'll have somebody, you'll read a news story, you'll see something going on, you'll be really quick to judge. And not very much longer later in your life, all of a sudden you've got family that's going through that. And you're like, oh boy. Changes everything when it starts to hit home. Because then you know them and you're like, oh boy. See, Jesus says, I have no speck. I have no plank, and I'm perfect. And here's what the perfect judge then does. Perfectly lives his life, innocent, completely sinless, and willingly goes to a cross. And while he's hanging on the cross, here's the words he says. Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. The perfect judge looked in that moment to people crucifying him, knowing it was going to accomplish God's greater plan. And it's like he said this, Father God, please let them live long enough to be able to hear the good news of the gospel, to be able to let them hear about me dying on the cross and me raising from the dead so they could come to believe in me. Father, forgive them. They don't really know what they're doing. And it wasn't excusing what was happening. It's just Jesus knew their brokenness. Jesus knew their desperate need for grace, their desperate need for mercy. And he knew that as long as they try to play the game to try to prove how good they are and how much better they are, or end up finding out they're worse than other people, that there was no hope for them. And he says, Father, forgive them. I know what's going on here. I can see it. And Jesus' blood takes all of us in our mess of trying to judge and put ourselves in some sort of standing, and he works it all out. And when he asks that question, why do you want to point out the speck in your brother's eye? Why do you want to be so quick to judge? I hope for you the light starts to come on, and you start to think, yeah, I need to understand my desperate need of grace. Let me tell you what a real Christian never loses sight of. How much grace really means. A real Christian will never lose sight of that. When you will constantly have before you, when you will constantly see how much you need to be forgiven, that is what a real Christian does. They always hang on to that because when they look at the scope of the world and see people's problems and see their sins and see what they're doing wrong, they will say, yeah, I'm desperately needing grace, and they desperately need that grace too. And the perfect judge, Jesus, comes without speck and without plaint, and then he's able to sit on that seat of judgment. And here's what it says now in Romans chapter 8, verse 1. It says, for now there's no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. See, now he gives you a way to have hope. Now he gives you a way to get out of this mess of back and forth and judging and try to figure out where you're standing and how you're doing. And he says, let it just be through me. Let me tell you how you're doing. In me, when you have me, when you get washed by the blood of the Lamb, you have complete, perfect, total forgiveness. And all judging is now gone. All condemnation is now removed because I took the judgment for you. And I take away your sin. And now all of a sudden, your life is different. Because you don't have to be caught in that mess of trying to figure out and prove who you are. You have Jesus. And he proves who you are. He proves how much you mean because of his love to give you the grace and mercy. Jesus says the measure that you use should be measured to you. As we think about what this then all means for our spiritual lives, we have to think about the measure. That's what Jesus wants us to understand. Like you hear this question, you find the answers, you sense what Jesus is saying about this spot that we find ourselves in. And here's what you have to remember. Jesus says the measure that you use, that's going to be measured to you. So let me ask you a question. This might help you then to know how to then live in light of what Jesus says here. Let me ask you a question. When you have to face an answer for your sin, what kind of hand do you want to come down on you? Do you want it to be the severe, heavy hand of God coming hard and heavy at you? You know what you want? You want the gracious, compassionate, patient, loving Father to be able to look at you and say, you deserve death, but I love you so much. I send you my Son, and my Son gives you life. Come on in. That's what you want when you are going to be standing for judgment for yourself. So then Jesus says, the way that you measure, it's going to be measured to you. You want the heavy hand? Deal the heavy hand now. That's how it's going to be doled out to you. You want the gracious, loving. By the way, that doesn't mean don't ever analyze and don't ever evaluate. That's not what this is saying. This is saying if you will understand the deep-rooted need of your own grace and mercy, and how much you need God's patient, loving kindness, you will then be able to deliver the kind of measure that you need to live. So live in that kind of way. That as you think about where people are and what they're struggling with, God has patience and kindness that would lead a person to repentance. So hopefully the patience and kindness that you can give can help lead that person to repentance. Recognize who you are and don't try to be something you're not. Don't try to be more than God's asking you to be in this text. I know it's used over and over again, but we're just one beggar trying to show another beggar where to find food. And that's really who we are. That's really where we're about. Is we found the way, we found life, we found grace. That's who I am, and that's what I want to be able to give to other people. I hope that in your life, if you've got damage from maybe feeling judged, that you understand that Jesus has said, I'm the judge. and I can see things, and I see your life, and if you don't have the forgiveness Jesus provides, you can have that today. And if you've been living your life in such a way that you've kind of been reckless with the way you've been measuring out, today you can actually repent from that too. You say, God, forgive me. I've been just treating people awful. I've been putting a heavy hand and a heavy burden on people. I just need to change my perspective and really have a loving heart that's gracious and kind as I interact with people. Change my heart, God. Help it to be new. This song we're going to sing as we close up, I think, just conveys everything. It's a song, Amazing Love. And as we sing these words together, I hope you'll really contemplate this message, because this is our song, this is our prayer, this is our life. Amazing love, how could it be that you, my King, would die for me? I'm forgiven because you're forsaken. That's the perspective we have as we live out this text. Would you please stand with me as we sing?